powers. We know what war powers are, don't we, today? Sure we do. Yeah, we still haven't figured out what the war powers of the president are. Well, in 1862, they hadn't even heard that there were war powers that belonged to the president. Because where is this phrase, war powers in the Constitution? It's not there. I mean, the president is designated commander-in-chief. What did that mean? Nobody knew. It had never been tested. But Lincoln has no other way forward. He's going to have to step out on the narrowest constitutional branch he has been able to find. War powers, a proclamation. But he issues it. He shouldn't have done that, should he? Boy, that was taking a big risk. If you had been Lincoln's advisors, you would have said to him, Mr. Lincoln, this is too risky. You're taking too great a chance. And who are you doing it for? Who's going to benefit from it? Black people? Who cares about them? Yet he does it anyway. He does it as he explained to Francis. He does it sitting in this building. He says, when Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia came across the Potomac, he made a vow to God. This man who did not belong to a church and had only the most meager religious profile of any American president except Thomas Jefferson. Abraham Lincoln says he made a vow to God that if Lee was driven back, that he would send a proclamation after him. And when Lincoln receives the news of the battle at Antietam, he calls together the cabinet and he tells them this. Imagine this cabinet, you've seen them in the Lincoln movie. I don't think there's a person in this room who has not seen the Lincoln movie. You haven't? Well, what are you waiting for? All right, this evening. I'd volunteer to take it. I mean, these hard-boiled politicians sitting around that cabinet table, and they're saying, why? Why? And he says, well, I made a vow to God. You did what? This is a basis for policy. But he had made an appeal to heaven. People thought this was a horrible thing for him to do. They thought it was going to lead to insurrection and race war, especially this provision in the Proclamation about recognizing and maintaining the freedom of such persons, and the military will do no act or acts to repress such persons or any of them in any efforts they may make for their actual freedom. That was read as an insurrectionary incitement. So people read that with horror, or they read it and thought he was just trying to create a trade-off with the Confederates. It was neither. He said, my whole soul is in this. I will never turn back from it. He would only go forward. He would only go forward to black soldiers, to the black vote, to the 13th Amendment. In the last annual message he delivered to Congress, he said, if any members of Congress, if the American people themselves want me to turn back from the Emancipation Proclamation, I will not do it. They must get another president, if that is what they want. And that was a promise he kept to the very end.
You really should write a book about that.
You think so?
My remarks today about a document that still manages to provoke a lot of debate over what it accomplished looks at it this way. How did the Emancipation Proclamation help Americans remain a constitutional people? No zing, indeed. I believe Lincoln's proclamation invited the American people, including the newly freed slaves, to act as a self-governing people in the midst of a civil war that threatened that very way of life. Specifically, I think that how Lincoln freed the slaves reflected a concern not merely that he do the right thing, but that he do so in the right way. This meant that he teach the nation. He thought he needed to teach the nation the connection between constitutional means and constitutional ends in a free society. In order to free American slaves, the president had to do so in a way that did not undermine the very protection that he sought for the freedmen, namely, a constitution and laws that express the consent, the delegated authority of the American people. He had to emancipate in a way that was consistent with the consent that legitimated his own presidential authority. Understood this way, the Emancipation Proclamation was a call to all Americans, black and white, to think and act as a constitutional people. For the loyal citizenry, Lincoln asked that they do their duty to preserve the Union by fighting a war of self-defense against those who sought to destroy that Union in order to preserve and extend black slavery. For slaves liberated by the proclamation, Lincoln asked that they take the initiative to act as free men, confident that the government of the United States would now protect them in that act. Protect them if so challenged by their former masters and disloyal Confederate allies. Of course, all of this was premised on a proclamation that described itself as a fit and necessary war measure for suppressing said rebellion. In order to do right by American slaves, the president believed he had to do right by the American citizenry. What he called the sheet anchor of American republicanism, government by consent of the governed, imposed a limitation upon his actions as president. Lincoln would be violating his oath of office, a public office of delegated authority and power, if he were to do otherwise. As he explained to the New York Tribune editor Horace Greeley, a month before he issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln did not believe the Constitution empowered him simply to carry out his personal wish that all men everywhere could be free under the guise of official duty. If the president decided to emancipate slaves, he could do so only by transforming a humane and moral end, the liberation of a people, into a lawful constitutional means. This took the form of a military proclamation, applicable to states or parts of states, as we learned. The people thereof were in rebellion against the United States. Implication for loyal slave states, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and Delaware, was that what the president could do about slavery there could not be dictated by sheer military might, but by constitutional right, which meant Lincoln's devotion to maintaining a constitutional union took precedence over the abolition of slavery. But he did so in a way that not only put the nation back on course of ridding itself of slavery, but also on course to acting again as a constitutional people. By deliberately writing his Emancipation Proclamation with no zing, writing it in dry legalese, the president drew attention to the constitutional propriety, or at least what he believed was the constitutional propriety of his act, trusting that the moral propriety would be manifest to all. Lincoln did, at the closing of the proclamation, incorporate Salmon Chase's suggestion that the proclamation includes some mention of the momentous justice being served. The closing sentence reads, "And upon this act, sincerely believed to be an act of justice, warranted by the Constitution, upon military necessity, I invoke the considerate judgment of mankind and the gracious favor of Almighty God." Here was Lincoln's literal bottom line. He accommodated Chase, but made sure that the proclamation's moral claim on the American conscience would not eclipse what he believed was most important for the nation to recover in the midst of a civil war, the rule of law, where the Constitution stood as the nation's fundamental law of the land and military necessity, the circumstance calling forth the president's authority under law. The extent of Lincoln's constitutionalism can be seen by how well he not only followed the Constitution, but also guided the American people to do the same, teaching them not just to obey the Constitution, but also why it's worthy of their obedience. What makes his Emancipation Proclamation an example of constitutional statesmanship is how it taught Americans both what he as president intended to do about slavery and why he thought he could and should do something about it. Once issued, he followed the proclamation with speeches that continued to inform the public about how emancipation furthered the Union war effort and reinforced the meaning of American self-government. This was most evident in his address at Gettysburg, where he took the occasion of the dedication of a national cemetery to remind the nation why they were fighting, why it was worth, as he put it, the last full measure of their devotion. At Gettysburg, Lincoln called the American Civil War a test, namely, whether that nation or any nation so conceived and dedicated can long endure. The permanency of the American political union, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. This permanency was being challenged by members of its own political family. If any question can be considered the abiding theme of Lincoln's political career, it is the question of how to perpetuate America's political institutions. How do a free people keep a democracy going? Gettysburg found Lincoln speaking of the unfinished work, the great task remaining before us, as the nation considered how to incorporate former slaves and former masters so that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. His exhortation to his generation of Americans turns out to be a call to every generation of Americans, every generation of a free people, to rise to the challenge of self-government. As his political heirs, our great task will always be a steadfast adherence to what Lincoln called the principle of liberty to all, as a guide to ruling ourselves according to a constitution that calls forth the better angels of our nature as long as we have years.